All right. I would like to start to talk this for just a few minutes here, talk about something that I have hinted at a couple of points in the last 2 days. It's been just below the surface, and now I'm going to bring it back up to the surface to look at. And I want to talk about discerning human motivation. What is it that drives people or excites people or sometimes leads people to run away from something because they're motivated very much not to do something? I want to talk about motivation and taking time to try and discern this in other people, because as we've said at a couple points, it's very important that we realize simply because I feel or believe or practice something, it does not mean that the person I'm working with feels the same way. They may, or they may not. And so I want to talk a little bit about just getting at motivation. The famous psychiatrist of the early 20th century, Sigmund Freud, a name that may be familiar to at least some of you, maybe to all of you, said, there are two basic human motivations in life. That he spoke German, so arbeiten und lieben, which simply means working and loving. Now we're going to go well beyond that, of course, but I'm going to start with something that's become a rather famous phrase, at least among people who study human nature. Working and loving definitely go a long way to getting us started as we talk about what is it that motivates people. I want to suggest that motivations come, and I'm going to erase this at this point, and then we'll start to add, you've had a chance to glance at this, we'll start to add some things with regard to today's lecture. Motivations are both positive and negative, all right? So there are motivations where we're attracted to something and we want it, okay? We're attracted to something and we want it, so that's a positive motivation. And then there are negative motivations, meaning that sometimes we're driven away from some kind of an action or involvement, maybe because of fears of what it might cost us if we do that. So I'm going to put first the big subject of this morning, motivation. Okay? I'm going to start with that there are both positive and negative. When you got up this morning, I don't know if you're like me, so I shouldn't assume that you are, but I can say many of us, we wake up in the morning and many of us take a long time to really wake up. Okay? And my first thoughts usually are, oh, I just want to stay right here in bed. and it feels awful good, awful comfortable. And once in a while you get to do that. Usually that's when you wake up, you're off and moving. So the question is, at that point, whether you're conscious of it or not, you are then propelled by either positive or negative motivations. For example, you may think to yourself, oh, I need to do something. It's my responsibility to do it. I'm attracted. That's a positive motivation. All right? Maybe I have to prepare something for my household before I even go out to do perhaps a job that I'm doing. That's a positive motivation. I'm called to do such and such. That's a positive motivation. Or here's a negative motivation. If I don't get up and get something done, someone is going to be upset with me, and I don't want someone to be angry at me. Therefore, I better do it. So one's a positive, one's a negative motivation. I have discovered, now this is just me talking with people over the years, I have discovered that many young adults in particular, you folks, no disrespect, but you're a little older than young, okay? You're not quite young adults, right? When I say young adults, I'm thinking teenagers, mostly, or early 20s, okay? Most, if not all of you, are good. So I'm going to speak about that population group that I most often interact with. So maybe it applies to you, maybe it doesn't. But I ask young adults sometimes, what do you want in life? And they're not really sure. They have probably an instinctual sense. And most people want a happy and fulfilling life. I think that probably is common to people. I want a life that's enjoyable and that means something. But if I say, what do you really want? They may be able to say, I want to do such and such a job down the road. That's fine. But very often people are not able to identify what positively motivates them. It's very interesting. I'm not being mean or critical. I'm just saying that this is a concern. This is a concern. Because people sometimes feel an obligation, or my parents expect me to go for education, I've got to do such and such. Okay, but then at some point, every one of us has to own the life that we're about. Right? If we don't have responsibility for ourselves, how are we ever going to be in some way able to contribute to other people? Right? And to be able to be responsible to ourselves and for ourselves, we want to be clear, at least growing clarity. Here are the things that drive me forward, that I need and I want to own being about. Ask yourself this question. This is not out loud. This is privately to yourself. To what degree are you clear about what motivates you? Start with right today, right? What led you to want to leave the comfort of where you were and come here? Okay, a number of possibilities. One very positive one would be, I'm curious what they have to offer that can help me do better. That's what drives me, in many cases, to go to listen to someone else, whether it's a preacher, a teacher, a seminar, whatever. I'm curious, what do they have to offer that I can say, oh, I like that. I want to run with it. That's a positive motivation. So I'm hoping that something like that fits in there somewhere. For many, once again, of the young adults that I am involved with, many of them, I don't know, that some of them, I'll be careful here and respectful, some of them do want to really gain skills, but many of them are thinking, I need that degree, because that degree is going to buy me a job, all right? And therefore, the easiest path that I can take to get that degree, to get that job, is what I want to do. And that's tricky. That's tricky. Because it's a mixed motivation. So I want to talk a little bit about motivation, positive and negative, and we're just exploring that. And in a few minutes, I'll get you to add some of your wisdom and insight to that. So major motivations, we've talked about that. It's interesting when you read stories of people in the Bible. And there's lots of stories, but so much of the Bible is narrative, right? It's stories about people. And it does not always give us motivations, but it often does. It often gives us a window into people's motivations. Let me choose some very well-known people in the Bible and their motivations. We'll start very early on with somebody like Abraham. Okay? Many of us would rightly call Abraham kind of a father in the faith. The guy really is attuned to what God is saying to him. And he has a meandering road. Sometimes he's very responsive to God, and other times, like when they're trying to engineer, how can I have a child now rather than waiting? And he waits a very, very, very long time to get a child. But Abraham's overwhelming curiosity is, what do I need to do to serve God? Now, he struggles with some other trust issues. Most of us do. But you get at least a bit of a window into Abraham's sense of obligation. Let's switch a little bit. Let's go down a couple of generations to his grandson, Jacob. All right? Jacob is an interesting character. All right? Jacob plays the game of life, namely, what can I do to get ahead of the other guy? Right? He's a bit of a trickster cheater. All right? He wants to get ahead of his brother, all right? And there's a mixture of some love for God in that, and some things just seem to be selfish. He's willing to engage help of his mother to trick his father, That's a dangerous game to play, isn't it? Right? He's willing to trick his in-laws to get an extra wife or wives, right? He ends up with 4, right? One of the most famous polygamists of the Bible. Is he a man who loves God? Yes. However, his love of God is a process that's opened up piece by rocky piece. And eventually, after his encounter with the angel, he limps the rest of his life, and he's being reminded, and this is a learning gig for many people, he's reminded by his own brokenness that God is bigger than him, and he can calm down a little bit. He doesn't have to keep on clawing ahead. But hey, we get to see Jacob's motivations. Now, there's limitless numbers of stories. I'm just trying to choose a few, all right? And I'm trying to be reasonable. I don't want to be judgmental, but I do want to understand the positive and the negative. David, a very complex individual, extraordinarily gifted, by the way, as is his son Solomon, who's going to push the boundaries in many, many ways. David is a man after God's own heart. The Bible tells us that, all right? But he too is one who is thinking about, how do I consolidate leadership? And leadership's tricky, because if a person does not want to be in leadership, they shouldn't be. But a person who does want to be in leadership may be capable of it, but may also bring with this a set of what someone has called the dark side of leadership, where the person's very strengths that make a good leader, or are good as a leader, can also be their biggest weaknesses. That's a thought for another time to explore, but I just want to open it up. You see that in David, you know. You see some wonderfully healthy motivations in David. David has a real heart for people in many cases, as he does for God. And on the other hand, David, as the Bible tells us, I'm not being judgmental, but as the Bible tells us, David is a man too given to warfare as a way of getting ahead. All right? So you get things like that. I'm going to give you one more example. Someone who has always fascinated me is the woman named Abigail. We're sticking around the time of David here. Abigail, you remember, is this woman who's married to a man who is a fool, all right? And I mean a nasty fool. Someone who is has a poisonous attitude, and here she is stuck in this situation where Nabal, her husband, we would just say in American dialect, he's a jerk. He's an aggressive jerk. And he's aggressive towards David, and he wants to undercut David's kingship. And Abigail is very interesting. She is a peacemaker. She wants to not have David strike back against Nabal, even though Nabal deserves it, but she wants to do it in a way that to some degree protects her husband as her husband, protects his reputation, albeit she's pretty blunt about him. She steers a very tricky road between the power structures of the day, and I think does so in a pretty remarkable way. What's her motivation? It would seem peace, right? Lack of bloodshed. These are good things. And the desire to make things work out okay when the situation is pretty rough. You know, some people are peacemakers. Jesus said those who pursue the kingdom of God are peacemakers. We have an expression, maybe it's the same here, there are certain other people who stir the pot. I don't know if you have that expression. No, they like to stir up strife and stir up anger and stir up differences. And that's dangerous. I noticed this cutting out, and I don't know, the battery seems to be okay, and I don't know why it cuts out periodically, but there it is. Anyway, I'll do our best, hopefully it's clear enough. So, people have motivations then and now, no surprise to all of us. Getting to know yourself is a very tricky thing. The Greeks have an expression, the Greek expression is gnophi auton, it just means know yourself. And that includes knowing your motivations and why you are doing what you are doing. If you are honest with yourself in ministry, you may find what many of us have found at different points in our ministry. Sometimes we do or strive to do the right thing, albeit we have to admit, for mixed motivations. This is is tough. But being honest with ourselves is pretty important. Sometimes I did the right thing in trying to minister to someone, and it was partly out of love for the person, but frankly, sometimes it was partly just, if I don't do this, there may be more problems, and I have some negative or mixed motivations. I'm just trying to be honest with myself and encouraging you in the same direction. Okay, so motivations include things like duty, we mentioned that already, albeit not by name. Love for people, these are good positive motivations. Sometimes we are motivated by being covetous. Somebody has something and we're thinking, I want that. All right? And that's tricky, but you need to know you, like everyone else, are a mixed bag of motivations that hopefully Jesus is purifying as we go along, but that's usually a process in life. That's part of sanctification. So the question is then, how do you get to understand somebody else's motivations, right? It's hard enough to understand ourselves sometimes, okay? But it's even harder to understand somebody else, especially when we may not be clear what really is on just below the surface. For example, if somebody is very, very generous to me, they just have something they want to give me, maybe it's a thing, maybe it's an opportunity, whatever. I'm questioning, are they generous because they see some good possibilities, or am I being played? Is someone simply manipulating me? They're being kind and generous because they ultimately want to get something from me, but they're not telling me. I don't mind if someone says, can you give me such and such? I can say yes or no. But what if someone's positioning me in a way and their motivation really is not a healthy one, even though on the surface they seem very kind, okay? So it's hard to understand other people's motivations. I like to quote a writer. It's a writer I like in a number of ways, and I disagree with some others. It doesn't matter the details. But anyway, the man's name is David Powlison. And David Powlison, in one of his writings, puts together what he calls X-ray questions. So you know what an X-ray is, right? That special scan usually done to look at your bone structure. You look through the skin, see what's going on inside. I think you all know what X-rays are, okay? So he says you can do X-ray questions that help you discern what is motivating another person. And you can use these for yourself, of course. All right? He says, I'm going to quote him here. Powlison says, the simplest way to discover why a person does, says, thinks, or feels certain things is to ask, what do you want? Good starting point, okay? What do you want? But as I've already said, sometimes people stumble because sometimes people don't actually know what they want. They've got inclinations, but that doesn't necessarily mean they understand their inclinations. Listen, we're humans. Good days, bad days. Good side, bad side. We understand aspects of ourselves, and frankly, through life, we're still discovering a whole lot more about ourselves. Sometimes we're the biggest surprises to ourselves. Imagine how much more in understanding. So let me add to what Powlison says. Some of the kinds of X-ray questions that he suggests that I'm willing to use, I don't like all of his suggestions, but I like some of them. He asks people things like, what do you admire? What do you admire? What are the qualities or the experiences that you would say, that's good, and I want to be about that? Okay? By the way, I'm going to answer a little bit of this for myself, if I may, just to illustrate. That's all. You don't have to agree with me, just to illustrate. I really like mixing together a subject that I enjoy and people, right? I want to study the subject, but I also like to take that subject and then interact with people and see how they interact with the subject. So, for example, for nearly 30 years, I've taught New Testament Greek and Old Testament Hebrew to various students. All right? I find languages very challenging. I'm not a quick language learner, but I'm fascinated about the way language works. It's a very complicated machinery, okay? And especially with the world having thousands of languages at its fingertips, I think this is an extraordinarily challenging area. I want to learn, I want to grow, and I like to work it, okay? Especially as I see other people coming to work with it. So that's just one example. One of the motivations I have is a subject matter I like with fresh learners. I like it. I like interacting and with mentoring people. And by the way, just so you know, I have my mentors. I like to give out. But please know, I have people that I run to and I say, feed me, help me, guide me, critique me. All right? Because I think if I tell you this is helpful for you, I ought to be practicing the same thing. Right? I have tons to learn. I know that I have tons to learn. And the more I learn, the more I realize I've not yet learned. So I like these kinds of things. That motivates me. Here's a different kind of question. It's an interesting one. What are you afraid of? You know, most of us are afraid of any of a number of things, or people, or situations, or whatever. What are you afraid of? It's a fear of a certain type and amount can be a very healthy thing. All right? Fear is self-protection. Fear says if I put myself in such and such a situation, it may be very, very hurtful to me. I live just outside the city of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is a very interesting hub of activities and history to be a part of. But there are certain places in Pittsburgh I will not go because I am not safe there, at least at nighttime. And so I avoid it. I don't go looking for trouble. I think to myself, I am not safe in certain circumstances, don't go there. Okay, that's healthy. Now, we draw lines in different ways. The way I draw my lines may be different from what somebody else draws. But the point is, there is a healthy side to fear. Okay, that's a good, it's not a bad thing. The Bible often says, don't fear, right? Fear can be taken and made into a larger blanket that we throw over ourselves and shut out the things we ought not to fear. That's the problem. This healthy instinct that is self-protective can be used to create walls all over the place. I was interested a few years ago, I've had this kind of dialogue a number of times with young adults. I said, I'm just kind of curious. I said, I know you guys text each other all the time, or you're talking by Instagram. And they said, oh yeah. I said, they would tell me, I could be in my dorm room, in my room here, and I'm texting someone who's just across the hall. And, you know, they could walk 15 feet and talk to the person, but they text instead. I said, that's funny. Why? And I was surprised by the response. I'm afraid of what happens if I go and talk to them face to face. I said, that's fascinating. I said, what are you afraid of? And I don't know, but I'm afraid. What an interesting response. Afraid of personal interactions with peers who are friends. And that tells me there's something up. I'm not going to explore that further. But that's an example, a simple example, of an unhealthy fear. There are healthy fears. There are certain people who are dangerous. And I don't mean necessarily violent. I don't mean that kind of danger. But dangerous in the sense that if they see too much of me, they will take what they know and they will misuse it. All right? So there's a healthy fear that says to me, don't give them that raw material. Avoid it. All right? On the other hand, there's also the calling of God that sometimes says, step into situations, God speaking, I will protect you. You know, because you read this in the Bible. In other words, sometimes we are called to go into places that have a degree of lack of safety. All right? Physical safety, social safety, psychological safety. All right? So, back to my original point here, asking people to be able to articulate On the positive side, what's important to you, right? And on the negative side, what are you afraid of? And people need to be able to understand those dynamics because, frankly, those dynamics are driving their motivations. Now, let me pick up something in this area of motivation. I'm sticking with it, okay? But I want to do a kind of a side study here. So many people of all ages procrastinate, right? They leave things to the last minute, right? Probably all of us procrastinate to some degree, okay? By the way, there are times where procrastination is very productive. It's not always bad, but a life that usually avoids taking steps may not be the best way to go. Right? So procrastination is what one of my mentors called brinkmanship. Right? You're at the brink of a problem and you don't fix what you have to fix or address what you have to address until the very last minute before you're afraid you're going to fall off a cliff. Right? So those who are professionals at that, brinkmanship. The question is, why do we procrastinate? All right? This is the motivation issue. Okay? And I want to suggest two major possibilities. You have to decide for yourself, and you have to decide in the moment. All right? There's maybe three major possibilities. One major possibility is that you have learned somewhere in your life that if I don't want to do something, I can leave it, but the sense of terror, when that hits me, that triggers my action. Right? If I don't get something done, I can wait, but oh, wait a minute, if it's going to all fall apart, I better fix it. And that's an unfortunate kind of reactive kind of motivation, right? It's unfortunate because you've learned somehow, and there's many ways to learn it, you've learned somehow, I can avoid, oh, but if it's awful, I've got to get it done. Here's the second possibility, okay? Second possibility is you are doing something, but frankly, you're not really convinced you ought to be doing it. You're doing it because you kind of have to, but frankly, you would rather be somewhere else. All right? I'm going to give you a very specific example, all right? Because of the area that I work in customarily, with young adult undergraduate students, all right? When there's a project or paper due for a course, it is very common for many students to wait till the night before, all right, and then try and get this whole paper done, and sometimes it's not done very well. And my thought is, wait a minute, if you are called as a student, right, if your calling is to be a student, at least part of the time, then you say you believe it's a priority in your life. So if it's a priority in your life, don't you want to do it now? If it's really a priority, don't you want to get your hands on it and start going? And many students do. That's good news. Many people do take up their priorities. But if someone consistently says, this is my priority, but I'm only going to do it at the last minute, I'm saying there's a motivation. I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but I'm raising the question. Do you really believe this is your calling? Because if it is, be about it. Be about it. Now, I'm going to allow for something. Once in a while, procrastination is a good thing. Once in a while. I'll tell you why. Sometimes you need to wait until certain factors come into play and all of the information that you truly need is there, and then there's the right time to act. So I will say once in a while, leaving something to the last minute has a place. I don't want to rule it out. But the first two big questions are something I pose to people in a friendly way to say, ask yourself, which of these is it? Have you been subject to this training over here which is unhealthy, all right, and you need to retrain your brain as a possibility, or other possibility, maybe they go together. The other possibility is you need to ask, do I really believe this is part of my calling? I'm going to say, and I say this with great sympathy, I've watched over the years in terms of pastoral ministry, all right, what happens with pastors long term? I came into a statistic, actually it was Dr. Starelli who pointed this out to me from a fairly recent study that suggests, now this is the United States, okay? I have no idea what this says about Kenya. The United States. Supposedly 85% of people who enter into the pastoral ministry will leave it permanently within 5 years. 85%. That's a massive number. Now, there's many, many reasons for it. I'm not exploring the reasons at this moment, but I'm just making an observation. A very, very large number of people are attracted to something. I like that idea, by the way. I'm glad they see something worthy in it. But in most cases, will decide, no, this is not where I need to be, and they're about something else. I'm just raising the question then. Why is that? Again, each situation is unique. But it tells me that people think twice once they've been battered around. We talked about this yesterday. They've been battered around. They're asking, what should I really be about? I know for myself, I'm going to speak just briefly about myself. I think probably because I moved so much in my young adult life, and because English is my native language, that's always been the case, but I've spoken about 3 different dialects of English depending on where I moved, and as a child, as a young adult, I was ridiculed by many people for the way I spoke because my dialect was from another place. And so I was not a regular stutterer, but in public presentation, when speaking in public, I would stutter, okay? And that's embarrassing. And so I had to ask myself, if I'm going to be a minister, I'm going to have to be speaking in public. You cannot really be a minister and not speak in public. What am I going to do about the stuttering? That was a good, I had to ask that question. And this was helpful because this refined my motivation. And here's what it came down to. This is what I was thinking, by the way. I was thinking this 45 years ago. I'm glad I was. I said to myself, I am not sure how to get beyond the stuttering tendency. Okay, at least in public speaking. However, I am so sure that pastoral ministry can be helpful to others as it was to me. If I'm going to make a fool of myself, I'm at least going to make a fool of myself trying to do some good. Here we go. So it took me years to work through the nerves and the stuttering and so forth in public speaking, but I did. And the motivation, at least, the problem helped me refine my motivation. Now that's a good thing. That's a good thing. And once in a while I slip up. Everybody slips up sometimes. But that was helpful. So I'm suggesting that an essential part of leadership in general and of pastoral leadership and ministry in particular, we need to spend time talking about and think to ourselves, what am I motivated by? Why am I doing what I'm doing? But also getting to understand other people's motivations. Let me tell you a couple of the lessons I've learned in doing this over the years. They're chosen randomly, but I hope that they're helpful to you. I said the other day, we need to make sure we do not assume that because we feel a certain way to someone, they necessarily feel the same way. I may really love some people and care for them. That doesn't mean they love and care for me. It's not a guarantee. We need to know that. So, a couple of the things I learned. So I was struggling. This was about 30 years ago. I was in a church serving at the time where we had a number of teenage pregnancies. Now, some of you mentioned, yes, that's on our list, okay? And we'll be back. I'm not dealing with it systematically here. I'm just telling you about a motivation example. I was dealing with a bunch of teenage pregnancies in and near our church. And I was concerned. These were young women. They were in their mid-teens, 15, 16, 17, actually 14, 15, 16, 17. And I can imagine any of a number of things to start with. But my question is, what else was going on? And as I kind of got to know, and I was working with a number of the women in the church who were helping these younger women, very important step, by the way, I was able to start to say, wait a minute, there may be a common thread of pregnancy, but there's different reasons for it. And I didn't get these. I learned this along the way. So there were situations where a young woman believed she had no value unless she had a baby. Okay? So she sought to get pregnant because in her mind at the time, she's thinking to herself, all right, if I have a baby, that cute little thing will love me. Now, any of you who have little baby children or had them, you realize that's a mixed bag. Because when they've kept you awake screaming night after night after night, they don't love you, okay? They need you, but they don't love you. You love them, but they don't love you. Not yet, anyway. But that was one motivation, but that was not the only. Okay? Here's another one. If I get pregnant, then the man who got me pregnant, or usually the boy who got me pregnant, is going to be obligated to take care of me. This way I can have income. In other words, what was perceived as domestic job security. Problematic. I don't need to comment on that. You know the problem with that. That was another motivation. Another motivation. Someone was attracted to someone and they had a fling and they got pregnant. But that was different, somewhat different from these other motivations. All right? Here's another motivation. If I get pregnant, my parents will be so angry at me, they'll drive me out of the house, I'll be free of the problem with my parents. Goodbye, parents. Pregnancy was the ticket out. Yet another motivation. Yet one more motivation. I discovered some of the young women I was working with, one in particular that's in my mind, loved drama and turmoil. All right? There was anything that stirred the pot, as we were talking a moment ago. Anything that stirred the pot gave them an inner sense of life must be valuable because it's emotionally a storm wreckage. Right? Now, notice the thread was the same one, teen pregnancy, but the motivations differed for the person. And they're not necessarily obvious at the outset. It took time to get to them. I remember sitting down years later with one of these young women, and I just, correct, I'm often wrong. In this particular case, I was right. I said to myself, she's one of the ones who loves turmoil, okay? And years later, she had multiple pregnancies as a single woman to multiple men, all right? And she was determined to go at it. And then this got very interesting. She ended up having a number of car wrecks in which she was almost killed. And she had a family member who kept on giving her a new car every time she wrecked a car, which was a mistake in and of itself. But it's the way it was. And then she finds a source of income. I don't know the details. I think it was the death of a family member gave her a lot of money all of a sudden, and she started to get into gambling. Okay? Very, very dangerous situation. And I thought, this gal thrives on turmoil. She just loves it. She eats it for breakfast, And I sat down with her. There was a woman in the church who I worked with closely and trying to help this. I thought sometimes it's best to be in the face of a young woman with another woman working, adult woman working with me. And I said to the young woman, I said, I get this sense you don't want to be helped out of these problems that you're in. You really kind of want to live this kind of a life. And she got, I can't imitate the look, but like her eyes lit up. And she had this smile on her face. And she just said, yep. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to be able to help. And it's very sad. Just a couple of years later, she was dead. She was dead. And by the way, the coroner could never discern. They were unable to determine exactly what it was that was her cause of death. We don't know. It was not something obvious, but whatever it was, she was dead, and she left behind a number of children who were still fairly young at the time. So I'm suggesting that this is a very important area, getting to understand yourself and motivations, getting to understand the people that you work with and their motivations, and just saying it really does take time. I'd like to quote again a very, very short statement from this writer, David Powlison. Again, I don't agree with everything he says, but I like some of what he said. He said, wise counselors don't just confront something. You know, sometimes people believe that if you're a really strong therapist or a really strong pastor, you could just go right at someone. You can tell them the way it is, you know, confront them, challenge them, call them out. There's a place for that sometimes, but there are many places not to take that approach. May I suggest, you can choose to consider this, Jesus used both. There are times he confronted directly, and it's interesting. Do you know who he tended to confront directly the most? Think about it. Who are the people where he was harshest and most direct with? Pharisees and the religious leaders. That's correct. In other words, people who were well-trained, well polished by other standards, who had the most time to think about what they're doing, and he had many negative things to say, like, you people put burdens on other people's backs, and you don't help them carry those burdens. You're hypocrites. So he was very direct with those kinds of people. Let's go back for just a second to an instance we mentioned the other day, I told you one of my favorite, Jesus with the Samaritan woman at the well. It's a fascinating conversation. It really is. It's a personal back and forth. Very interesting. Very interesting. I'm not saying he's not, there's a directness about it, but there's a willingness to sort of parlay. There's a verbal sword play going on as they go back and forth with things. And ultimately, though he opens up the painful part of her life, you've been with this person and this and this and this and this, and now you're here. He does that. But remember, this is a private conversation, at least at that point. He's not embarrassing her to other people. He's talking just to her. And he has this habit, often, on the one-on-one basis with, if you will, the average person, of working to bring out. That's what I find fascinating about Jesus' ministry. So realizing who we're dealing with and who we're not dealing with is also part of understanding motivation and understanding how best to approach them. May I pause and ask you a question here? Does this get you thinking about maybe situations you have been in which you had to sort through something very, very carefully to try and understand what really is driving the circumstances that you're seeing? And I'm just kind of curious. I have scores of stories, and you don't want to stay around for the next 3 months listening to them, okay? But you have stories. I'd be interested in hearing a couple of your stories. What are some of the situations you've been in where it's taken you time to gently unravel and ask, what's going on here, to understand? Have you faced this? I'm sure you have. Anyone want to share? Maybe one or two people share any of those circumstances? You don't have to, but I want to open the door for you if you'd like to. Please.
Yeah, thank you. You say that there are positive motivations,
Yes.
and negative,
Yeah, definitely.
motivations. And, basically, I am always afraid of being broke.
Yeah.
How can I turn it into a positive?
Great question. Always afraid of being wrong, being broke,
Yes.
broken. What kind of broken? Financial or financial broken? That's a great question. That's a huge area. May I ask you a question? The background you came from, poverty? Okay. Second question, don't give any details, it's just a big picture question, okay? The background you came from, did you come out of that saying, we were broke because we were broke, or we were broke because somebody ruined our finances? Do you know the difference? Okay.
You are broke because someone messed up.
I'll give one example of that, just one example. I don't know about your situation. I'm making a general statement. I know a number of families where, and it was usually the father, though sometimes it was the mother, was burning up finances, addicted to something, whether it was addicted to alcohol, drugs, or gambling. Okay? Or, one more, again, it happened to be a father, what I'm thinking of here, who was addicted to going to prostitutes and just spent money, found money on prostitutes. And so deprived his wife and his children of basic resources they need. So any of these things. Or sometimes people make a whole series of just bad financial decisions. Okay, good news. Good news, all right? There are resources out there in book and internet form that can teach you, can teach all of us, healthy financial choices where we're not waiting for financial security, but we're actually learning to practice financial security. There's a difference. I've been on both sides of this divide, where for many years of my life, I had just enough to get by. Enough food, enough clothes, but barely enough. And other parts of my life where I've had abundance. And some of it was the circumstances around me, but some of it was me having to learn what are the kinds of positive financial decisions that tend to give a degree of security. And negative, what are some of the mistakes I could make that would tend to reduce it? Many pastors, and you know this, are wrestling with this concern. Many pastors are wrestling with this concern. I know that. One of many things we do is we work hard to make the best of what we have to work with, whatever that looks like. We work hard to make the best out of little. That's the beginning of an answer only. But you're part of the answer. You're part of the answer. Motivation issues, where you were sorting through somebody's motivations. I'm going to mention a little book. It's interesting. The book is called Antagonists in the Church. I'm going to do a negative one here, okay? This is a Christian counselor who was writing specifically for pastors, just so you know, okay? Many years ago. And he said, there are various techniques people use to then win your favor and then become an enemy of you. And he said, he cautions at the beginning of the book, he said, not many people are true antagonists. Antagonists meaning someone who, no matter what you do, they oppose what you do. Most people are not that way. There are people who agree with you, disagree with you. But true antagonists, and he gives, I'm going to mention just one of the 36 mechanisms he mentions. He says, sometimes people become your instant best friend. I don't know if you have any instant best friends. You just met them, and they're like gold. At least they want to present themselves that way. Until they have your trust, and then they undercut you. Interesting. Okay? So, I love it when people are positive and friendly. Let me be clear. Okay? I love it. But I also am aware, once in a blue moon, someone will be friendly so that they can earn my trust, but then they're going to twist it later on. And I have in my mind, private to me only, I don't put the names out there, a couple people, one person I dealt with in the early 1980s, one in the late 1980s, there's one in the 1990s, okay? Three big ones that are there. By the way, all of them were men, not one of them was a woman. These were all scheming men, okay? Who were gifted men who became my best support and then my worst enemy and critic. It was interesting, like a switch flipped. That's a true antagonist. You know, most friends will agree with you and disagree at points. That's friendliness. But these are people who became your best friend and then your worst nightmare. Switch went over. So that was helpful to understand motivation. So when someone is so squeaky clean, so perfect, so engaged, so positive about everything, I'm thinking, okay, let's see how this goes in another couple of years. So being careful, not to be overly suspicious, but just to be careful, to realize people are people, and we sometimes are flipping. Okay, no one wants to share any other story at this time, that's fine. I'm still interested along the way to hear some of your stories in terms of gaining understanding of motivation. Dr. Strelli, you asked a question. You work in a field, maybe you come forward for just a second. You work in a field whereby the nature of your profession, you have to be suspicious of everyone you deal with. So I'm going to ask you a flip question. How do you move from working in an environment where you professionally have to be suspicious to working in an environment where at some point you have to balance that with some positive expectations? Just spontaneous thoughts on that.
I'm going to tell you a story. And this may help and answer some of the questions that you had on the board. I had a student many years ago who came from a difficult home environment. And his mother had passed when he was young, and his father wasn't very responsible. And my coworkers and I made arrangements for him to complete hygiene at the school, buy him clothes, give him food. I had gotten a parking ticket. It's $3. I put the money in a little envelope, put a stamp on it. I gave him a pass to take it down to the office to put it in the mailbox for me. 3 weeks later, I get a fine in the mail for $75 because he, in spite of all we had done, ripped up the envelope, took out the $3 and put it in his pocket. What that taught me, excuse me, at that point was it wasn't going to change what I was going to do. It wasn't going to change who I was. But I was going to be more careful about my person and my means. So I would have not changed helping him because that's giving him too much power. That's changing my character. That's changing who I am as a person. And I don't want that. I want to still model God's love. But giving him access to my money is a different story. I would have done that. It taught me a lesson. So, when we help somebody, I think that was a question yesterday. When we help somebody and they turn their back on us, when we mentor somebody, when we feel like somebody has betrayed us, I think one of the things that we have to do is we can't change who we are. We want to stay constant. We want to model God's love. But we also can be protective. So if somebody is not finding themselves trustworthy, maybe they don't have access to my inner circle. They don't have access to my thoughts. They don't have access to my finances. They don't have access to my family. So that you can still help, you can still mentor, you can still guide. But that access, those professional boundaries get put in place. And that's how I move with my clients at the prison. And that's how I move with my congregation members too. Okay? Now luckily, as you all know already, I have a wonderful congregation. And they're very small. So there isn't anyone there that doesn't have access because they've gained that. But if I were in a much larger church, I would be probably more selective about that, depending. I don't know if that helps or if that makes sense. But remember when we talked about the 5 basic needs yesterday? And what was this one? The middle finger one. That was power, right? Okay. So people are motivated by power. Okay? So if you were the pastor, you're in a position of power. If they can somehow diminish your power, they may feel like they're gaining their own. Okay? But that's not how true power works. Not at all. I hope that helps. Does anybody have questions or thoughts about that?
I do. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That gets me thinking about another example I'm going to add. I quoted yesterday 2 completely different men, both with the last name of Peterson. This is the writer Eugene Peterson, late pastor of a church and then later a professor to pastors. Anyway, Eugene Peterson describes church planting that he did in the state of Maryland many, many years ago. And he described this interesting phenomenon. He said it was an exciting enterprise. They took various steps to rent various facilities as they were growing the church, how they connected with the community. Very creative, very insightful, rather exciting. Spent a number of years building. Finally got enough money they could build their own church, build a nice church building. They'd sort of arrived comfortably, and he said the next thing that happened is a number of the people left his church. The very, very people who had been building with him all those years, had worked so closely with him, left his church. And he was curious. Why'd you leave? Was there a problem? No. He went to individuals. He said, I'm just kind of curious. You were with us all these years. The hard years you were with us, you moved on all of a sudden. Did I offend you? No. They didn't indicate a problem, but here was the thread. He said ultimately what they were interested in was the excitement of a project. There's nothing wrong with having excitement about a project, but that was what was their priority. Now that the church was well established, the excitement, that kind of excitement, was over, so they left. So he realized, okay, their motivation for doing what they were doing was, it seemed like it was, with him, but it was somewhat different. Helpful. And by the way, we don't want to spend our lives angry at these kinds of things. That's not constructive either. But just being realistic is a very, very important kind of a thing. I've had similar things in my own life where I truly thought I was heart to heart with someone, and have also experienced something apparently a number of you have had, where there were people, and again, I have the names privately to myself, there were people who needed my help to get across some kind of a barrier in their life, and we saw them through the barrier. And then they wanted to go to the next step, in some cases, theological education. So we helped them get through those theological education years, which are demanding. And then what happened is they came with a sense of, well, now we own the world, and they used their newfound skills to criticize, right? And I mean not just criticize me. You can criticize me, that's nothing. I'm an easy person to find fault with. But they then became contemptuous towards the Christian body. That's dangerous, right? And not many people have done this, but there are some that have, okay? And I cannot, and I like what you just said, the key is I don't want to change myself. If I know this is something good I'm holding on to, I need to keep practicing that good and not sell out my own soul, but I can find a safe distance. This ties in with a related topic, forgiveness, okay? Specifically, can I forgive someone but still want to keep a healthy distance from them? Sometimes, yes. Okay? Now, over the years, if they prove themselves reliable, I may rethink my distance down the road. But if someone has set a pattern of being undependable, unworthy, not loving, selfish, whatever this particular is, aggressive, I'm willing to forgive, but I'm not willing to then entrust them with something else. Now, when they set a new pattern, we'll talk more down the road. Maybe down the road is 10 years from now. Who knows? I don't know. But that's an important thing. It is okay to protect not only yourself, but also your family. Because if someone will make you a target, they may make your spouse or your child a target. And my children have told me some interesting stories over the years where they felt someone was trying to get to know them as a way of getting at me. That's not good either. So being, as Jesus put it, wise as serpents, yet innocent as doves. Not replicating the same evil, but also realizing it's in this world for now, and sometimes comes very close to me in a way that's uncomfortable. There's an interesting metaphor in that little tiny book of Jude. You know, the book of Jude near the very end of the Bible. Okay, Jude, it seems, is one of the immediate family of Jesus. You know, is he Mary and Joseph's son, or is he maybe Joseph's son by another man? We don't know the details, but it seems to be from the family of Jesus. And he talks, it's a rather negative, it's a short, rather negative piece, okay? One of the things I take away, I hope in a good way, is he describes certain people as hidden reef. Now, a reef, of course, is usually where you have some kind of a rocky or coral development underwater in the ocean, okay? But it doesn't come above the surface, it's just below the surface. So that when a ship comes along, the people guiding the ship cannot see the danger. It's just hidden below the water until the boat hits the reef, punches a hole in the boat, threatens the life and health of everybody on the ship. All right, that's a hidden reef. And he describes certain people as hidden reefs. When I was in my very first pastorate, I was about 6 months in. The first 6 months were wonderful. We have an expression in the U.S., I don't know about here, we call it the honeymoon period. Yeah, okay, you know what I'm talking about. Honeymoon period. Most pastors, at least at the beginning of a pastorate, have that period, and that's okay, that's good, until something breaks. And in that honeymoon period, okay, that's, or I should say at the end of that honeymoon period, that's when it's clear which are the hidden reefs, okay? You may have just one person like that. We need to not obsess about these things, but to be realistic and say that's the way it is. So anyway, I was at the end of my honeymoon period, and some of these things had just exploded in a way I didn't expect from the very people who had said, come, move to our area, minister to us, and a couple of them, not all, a couple, just then flipped. And I called up one of my mentors, man I quoted earlier this week, and I said to him, I said, this is what's going on. I said, I didn't expect this. And he asked me a very interesting question. I'll never forget it. He said to me, Jonathan, he said, which book of the New Testament does not describe strife in the family of God? Now, I did a quick survey like, oh boy, strife in the family of God. Gospels, Acts, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians. You got the picture. His point was, I thought, okay, I hadn't thought of it quite that way. But coming into the ministry is to be realistic and say, motivations are mixed, okay? Now, I've talked negatively a good bit. The question is, how do you tell good motivations? It's a fair question. How do you tell? You know, if something looks good, how do you know if it really is good? And there's many of those as well. I'll make a couple of basic observations. There is something consistent about the Christian life. By the way, Christian life has failures in it. All of us do. All right? No Christian life is this perfect trajectory from earth to heaven. I don't think anybody's quite like that. But there is a consistency or a stability or a continuity about the genuine Christian life. And people have weak times, absolutely, we all do. But when I see someone again and again and again doing good, growing in affection for God and for people, that to me is one of the fundamental ways to say, okay, this is what we want to be working with. This is the kind of foundation stuff on which the church is built. It's interesting, in connection with Peter, whose name means rock, Jesus said, you know, you're a rock. What exactly he meant, I'm still not sure, but he said, you're the rock. And there's something foundational about Peter among the apostles, all right? We all know that Peter had his blind spots, and I'm not here to ridicule Peter. The Bible just tells us some of the mistaken things he said, in particular at various points in his life. He has his shortcomings, right? But there's something foundational about Peter. Peter, when we first encounter him, the year is somewhere around the year, I don't know, we're going to say approximately 26, 27 AD is when we read stories about Jesus interacting with Peter. The last stories we hear about Peter are actually from Peter's own pen, the books of 1st and 2nd Peter. They're approximately, I can only be approximate, 4 decades, 3 to 4 decades later. Notice there's a constancy here. Failures along the way, shortcomings along the way, blind spots along the way, but a service of love and commitment and involvement. And so that ongoing consistency of life are the things that are the evidence that you're dealing with pure gold. I was doing an interview some years ago with it happened to be a Korean woman. I was at the University of Pittsburgh doing some graduate work in linguistics, which is one of my advanced areas. My primary advanced area is the area of linguistics. And I was doing I don't speak Korean, but I was doing an analysis of the sound system of Korean for a particular class. So I don't know Korean, but I just the sound system. And I was doing interviews with her as part of my assignment for this particular class. And she asked me about myself, and I was a Christian pastor, and it turned out she was a Christian woman. And I said, are you married? She goes, yes, I'm married. I said, oh, is your husband a believer? And she said, well, he's a nylon Christian. I said, what? She said, yeah. She said, he's a nylon Christian. You know what nylon is? Nylon is sort of a synthetic thread. She said, he's not pure silk. Another interesting picture, right? He's not pure silk. In other words, he appeared to love God. He actually treated her well, for which she was very grateful. But she discerned in the years after marrying him that there was something sort of empty that was there. Now, where it went long term, I don't know. But that's where she was at that time. I like to look for the silk threads that run through people's lives, right? And those silk threads, even when these people stumble or make mistakes, as I do also, I can say, I can be patient with that easy enough because I know the Spirit of God is doing good things through these people. So at the same time, we're encouraging realism as you get to know people's motivations, all right? Don't forget to be positive so that you can look at the people and say, there's real gold thread, real silk thread that is going through here. Let me give you one more example from the Bible. True story, we get just a couple of significant points. You know that one of the people who is mentioned in the book of Acts is a guy named John Mark, right? He is a nephew of Barnabas. John Mark, if we have the right connections, I'm going to be tentative here, we know he grows up as one of the apparently more wealthier people in the city of Jerusalem. Obviously, he's Jewish, he's wealthy by other people's standards. How wealthy, we don't know, but lives a relatively more comfortable life. So on the first missionary journey, when Paul and Barnabas set out, this is right leading up to what will be the Council of Jerusalem. It's Acts 13 and 14. Paul and Barnabas do a missionary journey to the church of Antioch, sends them out. They bring along John Mark, naturally because he's Barnabas' nephew. He's a believer, all right? He's good for work in the church, sort of. Now, we do not know the specifics. But in the middle of the first missionary journey, he quits. And he goes back home. We have no idea what the specifics, we just know they're in this vital project. They're taking a great risk, Paul and Barnabas, in going out into unfamiliar territories, blazing new trails. I have to admit, very challenging work. I do not blame John Mark for cutting out. I don't know the specifics, I just know the fact is he was unreliable and he goes home. All right, not the end of the world, but not the end of the story either. A couple chapters later, to just after the Council of Acts 15, Paul and Barnabas get ready to get sent out on a second missionary journey. All right? And it says a very sharp disagreement arose between Paul and Barnabas. And if you read the wording in Acts carefully, it does not place the blame on either man in particular. It doesn't give us an analysis of the conflict. It just says it happened, and it was severe. And it was so severe, the two men who worked together so closely in the first journey decide we're going to do better doing separate missionary journeys. We don't know exactly the details of Barnabas' journey, although he does go back to the island of Cyprus, which was his own. Right? And he ministers there, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. By the way, if you visit Cyprus to this day, you will find places that remember Barnabas' ministry. It's very interesting. But I'm going to go back to Paul. So Paul does the second missionary journey. He does the third missionary journey, no involvement in Mark. Okay, no problem. But it's very interesting when you get to the later letters of Paul, something starts to pop up. And he asks that Mark be brought to him. And he makes a very interesting little comment because he says, bring Mark along because he's valuable for the ministry. Very interesting. So the division over him occurs at this point, probably around the year 49. We don't know the exact, but let's just say a decade or more later, Mark has grown. He's strengthened, he's deepened, he's become more consistent. And thankfully, Paul can see that. And the affirmation is there. Now, that does not always happen. We know names of other people where it's the last thing any of us wants is our name to show up in the Bible saying, he's unreliable, stay away from him. Or her. We don't want that. But and there's people like that. That's all we know is the negative about them. But in this case, a man who developed, and Paul can see the development. I've wondered often, was Paul too abrupt? Maybe, maybe not. Was Mark too immature? Probably, but I don't blame him. We all have to grow, don't we? And that means patience with ourselves, patience with other people, and we need the patience of other people towards us. That's a healthy give and take. Part of loving, by true love, is willingness under the right circumstances to forgive and move on productively. That's the way it is. If we set those examples, we'll see good things. Not in everybody, but we will see good things. This is a natural turning point. I know that we're just a little bit shy of our normal break time. I want to stop here and take a half-hour break,